It's time for the outer borders for the Pumpkins and Potions quilt. Before I start the borders, I wanted to show you on a piece of paper because it's a little bit easier to see how I'm going to do them. So the book had us cut 4 strips with the fabric, which means that the selvages are at the top and at the bottom. And these are all long lengths. Now one of them will be quilted first and then cut in half, and those will become the top and the bottom of the quilt. That leaves us with 3 long strips, and they aren't long enough to go down the sides. One will be cut in half before quilting, and the half will be added and sewn on to each of the long strips. Don't be jealous of my illustration talents. So that will leave us with 3 strips to be quilted. 2 super long strips that are pieced together, and 1 long strip that then will be cut in half after we quilt. Now, a couple of things about this. My quilt, as it stands now, and I will show it later, measures from the top to the bottom in the middle, which is how you're supposed to measure to get the sides. Mine is 56 inches tall. And so when I quilt these strips, of course, I'm going to have to quilt multiple borders to get this whole entire strip quilted. And if I use the 2-inch, we're going to use the 2-inch border. If I use a 2-inch by 14-inch border, I will need to quilt this long strip 4 different times to equal the 56. Now that's exactly 56 inches, and I'm okay with that because there will be a 1/4 of an inch seam on the top and the bottom. And if for some reason there's a little tiny gap between the top and bottom borders, I think I'm okay with that versus quilting another one or adding, you know, a whole nother section. So I'm going to, as of right now, quilt the 2 by 14 inch 4 times. And on this strip, I will just quilt all 3 of these in the same hooping, and I will just quilt this until it's covered the complete border, and not worry about if some of the quilting runs off into the stabilizer. Now, another thing that I want to mention is how I'm going to lay these out in the hoop. So we are going to pretend that these are our 2 long strips that have been pieced, these right here, and then we have the 1 full piece that will be cut in half later. And if you look at these, I'll have a long piece and then a half a piece pieced, and a long piece and a half a piece pieced. But I don't want to lay them in the hoop with both of the seams towards the bottom. And let me show you why. So when I put these borders on, I want the bottles, which this border is one of the cutest things ever, but it's like bottles and books on a shelf is kind of what this border looks like. And so when I put the border on, I want all the bottles on the top, of course, facing up like you're looking at a shelf. When I come around to the side, I want them facing out so that they're in the same direction, almost like they've been stacked around. So I want them this way. On this side, I want them the opposite way because I want them, so if I were to turn this, you know, that would be bottles on a shelf. So I plan to do that, but I am going to change the bottom border piece. Now, if you watched my spring showers quilt, I did the same thing with the wagons. The wagons ran along like they were going around the quilt, but on the bottom, I also made them correct facing so that they were not upside down. The directions and the picture in the book, and I'll show that in a minute, does have the bottles upside down. And while that would be technically correct because all the bottles would be facing the outside of the quilt, I don't want my bottom piece bottles to be upside down. So this bottom section, the bottles are actually going to be right facing. They will be exactly like this top border. So when I quilt this small piece that will be cut in half, it doesn't matter. I will just turn it, you know, the correct way that I want and sew them on. When I sew the piece for the right hand side, I want the seam to be at the bottom of the quilt versus the top. And so on my hoop, let's pretend this is the 9x14 hoop, I want the seam, just like this picture, to be towards the bottom of the hoop when I start. So this will be the top long piece, the seam, and then the rest, you know, coming off the bottom of the hoop. Now, I don't want that on this piece that will be on the left-hand side, because if the bottles are all facing to the top when I quilt them, if I put this piece, that seam down, and then flip it because I want the bottles to face this way, the seam will be at the top. And really, it probably wouldn't matter because it's dark fabric and there's lots of the white stitching for the bottles. But because it would be easy to not do that, I will flip this piece. I could also flip the actual file when I go to Embrilliance, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put the piece on so that this piece will have the seam at the top. I will start with the shorter piece, and then the long piece will be towards the bottom. So these will be opposite in the hoop. So I hope that makes sense. So both seams will be at the bottom. Again, that doesn't bother me. Hopefully we won't even be able to see them and it won't matter where they are. But I would rather have them towards the bottom of the quilt versus more at eye level when you're looking at the quilt on the ladder. So that is kind of an overall plan of what I'm going to do. I thought it'd be easier to kind of see what I'm doing on paper. These strips, of course, are very, very long, and it might be hard to get a picture of the whole thing. So this is my plan. So let's get to the actual fabric. So here are the 4 strips of fabric, and the selvages, top and bottom, and of course this is just a super long, I don't know, probably 42 to 44 inches long. So when we look back at our paper, this right one will be left just as it is, and we will quilt the entire thing. That will be for the bottom and the top. This next piece, which is this second piece, I am going to cut that in half, and then I am going to attach half to this strip and half to this strip, and then that will give us our 3 strips. Now I wanted to show again, when I bring in the file to the software, it comes in facing this way. So the bottles face to the right. So for all of the strips, the background will be stitched in this way. And that's why the seam will be on the bottom of one and at the top of the other, because when this is stitched, and then I want the bottles to face to the left, I will flip and I don't want the seam at the top. So again, I hope that makes sense as to why I'm doing one of the seams at the top and one at the bottom. So now I'm going to get these cut. So I seamed my strips together and you really can hardly see them. Here is one seam and then here is a second seam. So again, it probably doesn't matter if, you know, I put one seam at the top and one at the bottom. I'm still going to do that, but you can tell, you can barely even see it. And then of course, once all the stitching. So on this one, here's the seam at the top and here's the short piece. So this is how I would have it in the hoop. And then this seam, this is a short piece on the bottom. So again, when I quilt this one that has the seam will be at the top of the hoop. When I quilt it and quilt the whole strip and put it on the left side of my quilt and flip so that the bottles are going to the left like I want them, this seam now will be at the bottom because here is a short piece. So again, I hope that makes sense. So now what I'm going to do is I've pressed open the seams. I am going to go put fusible interfacing on the back. I didn't want to put the fusible interfacing on before I seamed them because then that is just more bulk. So I'm just going to lay the interfacing over the seam and I think we'll be good to go. So I'm going to do all three pieces and then it's time to start the quilting. I've cut all the batting strips from the large piece of Warm and Natural. I didn't measure, I just cut off a piece, the width that I needed, and it's just a long piece, kind of like the strips, and I will not cut these to size. I will just quilt them as I go, and then I'll cut off the excess at the end. So I have all three strips of batting, and I have all three of my border pieces backed with the interfacing. So now it's time to get quilting. I have opened Embroidery Essentials and I need to bring in the border. I can use the merge stitch file icon at the top, but I like to go to the folder where I keep all of my files, and I will open the quilting bundle. And I need the border. I am going to use my 9x14 inch hoop, so I need to choose the 2 inch by 14 inch border, and I will drag and drop it into the hoop. Now the last hoop that I used was my 7x12, so I will come up to the preferences folder and change to my 9x14. Then in order to see the entire hoop, I will come to this compass and select H, and that will put the whole hoop onto my screen. Now, as I said before, I will be quilting the 3 strips for the borders all at the same time. But before I make a copy and put those 3 background quiltings in the hoop, I need to make some changes. I'm going to come to the right hand side, and again, these have the same 5 steps that our other background quilting has. It has the placement for the batting, the tack down of the batting, the placement for the fabric, the tack down of the fabric, and then the quilting. So I am, with the borders, going to cut my batting to the exact size. I do need the placement for the batting so I know where that goes. The second step is the tack down of the batting. I don't need that, so I will hit delete on my keyboard. The next step is the placement of the fabric, and again, our borders are cut wider than this placement line, so I don't need that. I will hit delete on my keyboard. Then the next step is the tack down of the fabric, and I do need that. Now the only difference between these tack down lines versus our tack down lines of the blocks are that these are just run along the sides of the border. They are not on the top or at the bottom, of course, because our strips are longer and it will just look like a continuous border. So that's the only difference with these tack downs, is that they are just on the sides. And then of course the quilting. So now that I have those changes made, I need to make 2 more copies. So I am going to select, I am going to Command C to copy. You can also right click and copy. And then I am going to Command V to paste. And I'm going to Command V 2 times. So now I have 3 of the borders. They come in centered, so it still looks like I have 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the third, and I'm going to use the arrow key on my keyboard and move it all the way to the right. Then I am not going to move the second because that's in the center, and then I will go up to the first design, which is the very first one I brought in and is on the bottom, and I'm going to move that all the way to the left. Now you don't have to do that, but the machine will stitch in this order, and so it will stitch the first, then the second, and the third instead of bouncing around. Now I can stitch these as is, but it will stitch each border start to finish. If we go to the stitch simulator, you can see it will do the first placement, tack down and quilting, and then the second placement, tack down and quilting, and then the third. And that's would be fine, but we're in software, and so we are going to combine or color sort these so that all of the steps run at the same time. So I will come to Utility and Color Sort. And it's been changed by 6 colors or 6 steps. Always select a new view. So now this is one design that has 3 steps. So the first will do the placement for the batting for all 3. The second is the tack down of the fabric for all 3 pieces, and then finally the quilting for all 3 pieces, and that's exactly what we want. So I will come to File, Save Stitch File As, and I will name the design. I will save it into my Combined Files folder, and then I will add it to my USB so I can take to my machine. I will go to Embroidery, to my USB, and to my Combined Files folder, and I will choose the borders. I will set an embroidery, and I will go to the settings and choose my 9x14 hoop and select OK. I will go to the plus minus needle in case I need that. So the first thing I'm going to do is stitch out the placement for the batting. So I'm at my table ready to place the batting and the fabric, and I first wanted to show that I still have the stabilizer attached to this hoop. Now this is something that I'm going to have to cut each time, but I left it on the roll Again, this is totally optional. It's not a big deal, but when these are done stitching, we are going to cut the stabilizer right at the bottom of this placement line. And so if I had just cut my stabilizer, say to here, well, that's not a big deal. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 inches. And I were to do that 4 times while I do all the borders, that's almost another whole entire hoop that I could have used. And so again, that's a totally optional step. Sometimes it's kind of cumbersome because this kind of gets twisted and I'll have to, you know, straighten it out and roll it up. I do drop it on my floor in front of my machine and, you know, pull some slack while this stitches. But this is just what I've always done. And I think it saves in the long run. But again, it's totally not needed. And you can just cut, you know, the piece that fits your hoop. So let's get started on this batting. So I have my 3 long pieces of batting. I just have, you know, an old box that I'm going to use because I am going to spray. You can use any temporary adhesive and spray. I either use the 505 or the Skinold KK100. I will spray just, you know, a portion that will go into the placement lines, and then I will place the 3 strips. The balance of the strips are just hanging off the bottom, and that will be the same as the border strip. So let's get these put on. So remember, the right side is going to be for just the one strip that has the selvages on both ends. It's just one length of fabric that we didn't cut yet, we didn't piece. And so I am going to put this a little bit above the top. And because our fabric's wider than even the placement line for the fabric would have been, I am going to fold it back to start. And I am just going to center it between the batting. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, this is wider than we need, so we'll be able to tack it down, and then we are going to trim it. So as long as I'm pretty even on both sides, and I do have a little bit extra at the top, I'm just going to kind of walk down and make sure that this fabric is as even as I can get it. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, over the batting. I am going to put tape on the top and at the bottom. Here is where the placement, and that's it, the stitching and the quilting won't go past that. So I'm just going to make sure that when I tape, it's just below that. Now I will do the same for the other 2 strips. But remember, again, I am going to place this strip this middle strip, the seam is going to be hanging off the hoop. The third strip, the seam is going to be towards the top. It's not going to be in the hoop yet until the second hooping, but the seam is towards the top versus the bottom. So let's get these put on. So I wanted just to show a picture. I'm on the last stitching of the tack down, but here is the hoop towards the bottom. And again, I have all of my batting, my strips, and my stabilizer all hanging off to the front. I adore this border. And I did want to mention a few things, that if you choose not to leave your stabilizer on the roll, your stabilizer would end, say, about right here, but you would still have your strip of border fabric all the way down, hanging off the front. Oh my gosh, I can't wait. So I was about 3/4 of the way done with the middle strip, and my bobbin is empty. So I changed to another white bobbin. I'm going to hit return. And again, because it's in the middle of a design, if I just start my machine, it's not going to do any sort of tacking stitches, locking stitches. So I am going to move back. I think I'm just going to do 10. I could just do, you know, a couple. This is kind of a sketchy font, and there's several places where, you know, the stitching goes over another stitching line. So I'm going to move back 10 so that it kind of goes over that part that had to be cut. So now I'm going to continue. Okay, so here are the borders done, and I have to say I adore these borders. I love them, and I know I have already said that a couple of times, and honestly, I can't guarantee that I'm not going to say it 17 more times before I'm done with this quilt. These are just so cute. If you look, we've got a cute little potion bottle with the label. We've got some, you know, spider webs and spider, and there's that cute 31. The potion bottle even has the same top. Some books. There's the candle that we did. This is just, I love it. I love the look of it, and I think this is one of my favorite things of the quilt. So I wanted to also show you one thing that I did when I was stitching these two placement lines. So at first it, you know, did this one, and then this one, but of each strip it does the left, comes down this way, then it stops, and then it jumps, and then it makes this tack down on the way up. And so to have these as flat as possible, which I think you can see, these are pretty flat. As this started to do the tack down line up, I put my hand behind the embroidery foot. Now the embroidery foot, you know, goes super fast, so you've got to be careful not to get your, you know, your hand or your finger stuck under the foot, or, you know, hit by the foot. You could use a stiletto or a chopstick or something like that. But I held it an inch or so behind, and as the foot was tacking down, I was behind, kind of pressing this fabric to the right so that it didn't kind of round in the middle. When you do a small border like this, if you were just to, you know, let it come down and go up on its own, sometimes the fabric kind of gets, you know, rounded. And these are pretty flat, and I haven't even pressed them. I mean, you can see they're still on the hoop, and they look great. I love it. So that's one thing that I would suggest doing, is you don't really need to do it on the left one, although I kind of did run my hand down like this as it was stitching down. But I definitely, on the way up, kind of pushed this fabric to try to smooth it out as much as possible. And I think it looks great. So now it's time for us to take this out of the hoop and get us set to do the next section of the border. So it's out of the hoop, and again, I have the roll of stabilizer still attached. It's coming off the right hand side, but I have it kind of under the table, and it's sitting off to my left hand side for right now. And the first thing that I need to do is I'm going to flip all of these fabric and batting back over to the left so that I can cut off this excess stabilizer. Now, you can see that here is the end of the stabilizer, and I'm not sure, so you can see that black stitching, and that's another reason that I did a dark placement line for the batting so that I could see exactly where to cut it. Looks like this little piece right here at the bottom at the start is tacked right down, so you can't see it on this side, but you can see the rest. So I'm going to cut, and let me maybe show the back. So here is, you know, the placement for our batting, and this little key is, I mean, it stitches right on that black line. So I'm going to cut as close as I can and as straight as I can. I'm going to cut the stabilizer off, of course. Don't, you know, cut the batting or the fabric. And that's our first step, is to get this remaining stabilizer off. So now on the back, I don't know if you can tell, I have almost all the stabilizer cut. I'm going to cut from the back now as close to that line as I can. Of course, remember not to cut the batting. I'm just going to trim it as close as I can, because that is what we're going to line up after we do our next placement of the batting. We are going to line this end up with the placement. And then that one's pretty good, right on the money, except for just right here. So now that I've got that, I am going to go ahead and just cut these apart so it'll be easier to place them. I'm going to cut the excess just a little bit off so I don't have quite as much hanging off. I'm really not going to worry too much because that's going to be cut off at the very end. But I just want to try to get, you know, as much of the bulk as I can. And this placement, you can see how much room there is on each side. So while we did our best, you know, to center the fabric over the batting, you still have a little bit of, you know, of leeway. We will measure this. Again, we won't just automatically assume that we're going to cut on these lines. We'll need to measure to make sure that we don't need to make any adjustments to the final size, and we'll get to that later. So now all I have is the first strip, or the first 3 strips, but the first of the 4 hoopings that we're going to do. I'm not worried about this stabilizer that's hanging off the edge right now. I just cut it away. So I am going to hoop my stabilizer again, and I'm going to go run the next set of placement lines for the batting, and we'll get these ready to go for the second hooping. Okay, I'm back in my embroidery machine. I have my hoop put back in, ready to do the second hooping. And this is where I finished off. It says, are you finished? Because, you know, I did everything that I need to do. And I will select okay. Now from here, I don't need to do anything because now it's ready to start over. You can see that's at the very first, ready to do the placement for the batting. And I will just keep doing that over and over. So there's nothing special I need to do other than just start. So I've done the next set of basting stitches, and I have the smallest of the 3 strips that will go onto this right hand side. I've put a little bit of spray adhesive on this batting, and what I'm going to do is, the reason we cut this so straight is because of course we want to line it up with the top, make sure at the top of your hoop at the same place as this, and then we can center the batting, and then our border will just start at that and continue. So I'm going to fold this back so that the quilted piece that I just did will go towards the top of my hoop. And I'm going to align, it's kind of hard because this is a little bit sticky. I'm going to fold back right where that stabilizer, where I cut it off. So I will line that up. And then I know that I will just line my batting up with the placement, and then I will be good to go. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to hold everything down except for the batting, since I've got that sprayed, and I'm going to flip the long piece of batting, and I'm going to align that, and I cut a little bit short right there, a little bit thin. So I have aligned that batting, and I've got this lined up right at the top, and I'm going to tape the top of this, and then I've got a big long sheet of paper that I use sometimes on my heat press, and I'm going to put this under so that I can spray some adhesive. Let's see where it ends. So about right there. And it won't get all over my hoop or my table or anything. So I'll do a little bit of that. And then again, I will just make sure that this is as centered as I can get it. Remember, we have some room to play with, but of course it would be best if we could line it up as even as we can. And then I'm going to press it down. And see all these little frays that come off the edge. I'm glad that Kimberbell had us cut these borders wider than they needed to be. I think on the spring showers quilt that I did, they were cut exactly to size. And even though you put stabilizer, sometimes you still get fraying. So I'm glad that we'll have, you know, a good amount to cut off so that that won't affect anything. So I think that looks pretty good. And pretty even. I'm happy with that. And then I will do the same thing to the other two. So let me show you what I decided to do. And I think I did this on my other quilt and maybe had forgotten that instead of spraying just the batting and then putting that down and then, you know, spraying this and putting that down, I think I'm going to go ahead and spray the back of the border. Again, it doesn't need a whole bunch. And then I'm going to lay this down, and that way I can kind of get it even. And then when I'm putting this on, I will just line up the edge of the batting with the placement line. I will go ahead, I don't want to get too much, so about right there. So I will go ahead and add, not a whole lot, but, and then we can get this placed. So here is our second hooping. There is the first that we did, and make sure that they are not, you know, tucked under and accidentally get stitched, you know, under the hoop. Make sure that they're all the way out. And then of course the rest is hanging down. So let's get the second one done. I'm stitching this second hooping, and I wanted to show you something that I just noticed. If you look down at the design, if you can see, oops, I just stopped it. I'm going to show you this. If you see that key and the kind of the rounded part actually go below that placement line, so when it stitches, it will actually go over that placement line a little bit. So let me show you where the two meet at the top. And the top, actually, the little rounded part of the stitching do the same thing. They kind of go to the past the top just a little bit. So if you look right here, this is the end of the first one, and this is the top of the second. You can see how the key overlapped the bottle, which, you know, is not a big deal. This is kind of has a little bit more stitching. So when I place the third hooping, I am going to put the line of the stabilizer that we cut back just a little bit, maybe like a 1/16 of an inch. These will probably still overlap because they're just, that's kind of the nature. See how they're kind of rounded? But anyways, I wanted to show you that. Does it matter really in the big scheme of things? No, it's super cute. And on this one, you can also see this one, I didn't quite get lined up. I mean, I double checked it and the batting is lined up, but you can see that the placement line's off. These, you can see, are pretty much right on, but it'll all work out in the end. So I'm going to keep going and finish these next two up. So I've got done with the second hooping, and let me show you what I did. So here are the first two that overlapped a little bit. This one, the middle one, actually overlapped even a little bit more. And then, you know, of course I wasn't going to worry about it, but when this third piece started, this bottle was almost next to this bottle. I must have kind of shifted when I was taping it. So I did go ahead and I took this off the stabilizer. I, of course, left it in the hoop, took out the basting stitches, realigned it further apart. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. And this one stitched out, I think, perfect. The little rounded ends of each of the stitching, you know, kind of touch each other. The key doesn't overlap the bottle. And so I think that looks good. So I'm going to set it for the third hooping, and I'll show you what adjustments I made for this one. Let me show you the back. So here is the first hooping that I did. And if I flip it over and show you that, you can tell that the stabilizer, of course, is the second hooping. And you can see just by looking that if this were to lay over, it actually overlaps that basting from the first. And you might be able to see it. This black line is for the second, and this is where it should have been lined up, and that's why they got so close, because the way I folded it, I guess it just, when I folded it, it scooted closer to the placement line. So that's how come they overlapped. So for this third one that I fixed, you can see that they look the same amount, but this line is the new stabilizer and the bottom line. So there's a gap of about a 1/16 of an inch versus these are an overlap of like a 1/16 of an inch. So I hope that makes sense. And I'm going to show. So what I'm going to do is first I'm just going to cut this stabilizer, and I'm going to cut it. I'm not going to cut it right up to it this time. At first, I'm just going to get rid of this. I am going to cut it close because, of course, that's the whole point of keeping the stabilizer on, is to, you know, to say what you can. So that goes to the roll. So now last time I cut right next to that line that's on the placement line that's on the stabilizer. So this time I'm actually, I'll start with this one. I'm going to cut about a 1/16 of an inch past. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but so this is, instead of right on this line, this black line, which is the placement, I cut just a little bit above that. So that's what I will do for the rest of them. And now I'm going to cut these apart and get rid of the extra stabilizer on the sides. Again, I'm just going to roughly cut them, and we'll worry about the excess at the very end. So I haven't sprayed this yet with the temporary adhesive, but I want to show you how I'm going to line this up. So remember, I just cut this farther away from that stitching line that I did the first time. So there's that little overlap, and I'm going to line that edge up to this so that there is a space between that stitching, and I think that will make it line up a little bit more like I want it. So let me show you again. I don't have my adhesive on yet, and you can see this is the short strip because it's the one on the right, and you can see my batting is much longer, and I'll just cut that off when I'm ready. So when I bend back, you can see this overhang. So instead of trying to butt it right up against that, we're going to line that line up with that end of the stabilizer. And again, we'll line up the sides of the batting with the placement. So do you see how now there is a space? So when I fold over, if they do overlap, it won't be as much as it was the first time. So that's how I did this strip when I redid it, is I put a little, I don't know, 1/16 of an inch space. Now you don't have to cut your stabilizer like that. I guess you could cut it close and then just fold it back and leave a gap. But that's how I chose to do it. So that's how I'm going to put these on. The rest will be the same. I'm going to go ahead and spray the back of the fabric. I'm going to place the batting. I'll spray this, and then I will line it up and then tape it. So I'm going to get all three ready, and we'll start our third hooping. So here is the third strip, and you can see that they don't overlap, and I think it looks great, and I think it looks great either way. I love, love, love this border. I just ran the placement for the batting for the last hooping, and you can see that I just did partial for this third, which is the smallest of the three strips. It was that one single strip that we didn't cut or didn't piece anything to. And so it started up here, and I let it run, and then down the side just for a couple of inches. Then I stopped my machine, cut the thread. I came over to these plus needles, and I just went 10 at a time. I think I might have done 100 and then went to 10s until the needle got to about the same spot, and then finished this little piece. I only have an inch or so on that last strip that I need to quilt, and so of course I could have just let it run the whole way, but I just went ahead and did a portion of it. So now I'm ready to place the fabric for the last hooping. As I'm stitching this last set, I noticed even more things about the border. So on this book, it is the same scroll that was used on one of our potion bottle labels. And then this book, these little designs, and I think this little design on this label are the little kind of bubble looking things that are on one of the background quiltings. So even more. Great, I love it. Done the two full strips, and I am now to the one on the right hand side that has just about 1.5 inches. I probably won't even need that, I'm not really sure, but what I've decided to do is just stitch, you know, 1 inch or so of the background. However, the background doesn't just start up here and go work its way down. What it does is it starts up here, it does one of these lines all the way down, kind of as a baseline for all these. Then it starts and does all this quilting, the whole border. It comes back up, and then it comes down all the way, then up, then down all the way, and then back up. So it has 5 little lines. So I think what I'm going to do, and I did slow my machine down since I have such a tiny bit, I'm gonna let it start, and it's gonna do this first line that goes all the way to the end. I'm just gonna let it stitch over into the white, and then I'm gonna stop. Then I'm gonna come over and just use my plus needles, and I'm gonna watch the design, and I'm gonna let it go through all of the design until probably, I don't know, I'll see where it lands on the fabric, but probably this last bottle. And then when it gets done with the last bottle, again, it's gonna do a line all the way down, and I'm just gonna let it go for a few inches. I'm gonna stop, forward through all that, start it again, do up and down, stop, let it go through, and then do the last stitching. So it seems like kind of a lot of work, but I'm just not sure if I'm gonna need that little bit done, and I don't want a huge gap. Like if I would have ended and it would just been, you know, a ½ inch or something, I probably wouldn't have quilted it, and I may not even need that. So we'll see, but that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get that finished. I love how these borders turned out. All 3 strips are done, and I have decided, since this video was much longer than I had expected, I will be doing a part B on trimming them to size and attaching them to the quilt.